By the seventh night, our entire neighborhood was walking around with flashlights like we were living through some kind of power crisis. People were posting angry messages in the community Facebook group every 10 minutes. Dogs were barking at shadows, and the president of the homeowners association was standing on my front porch looking like he'd aged 5 years in a week. The funny part was that nobody knew how simple the solution really was. Well, almost nobody. Looking back now, the whole thing started with 2 little bikes, 2 excited kids, and 1 man who confused authority with common sense. My name is Ethan Carter, and at the time this happened, my wife Melissa and I had been living in Willow Creek Estates for a little over 6 years. It was one of those picture-perfect suburban developments outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where people cared more about lawn stripes than they did about their own blood pressure. We had twin daughters, Lily and Emma, both 8 years old, and that summer had been a big one for them. After months of scraped knees, wobbling handlebars, and a lot of patience, they were finally ready to ride without training wheels. If you've ever watched your kids reach one of those little milestones, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It wasn't really about the bikes. It was about seeing them grow up right in front of you. Every evening after work, I'd walk outside with them, we'd grab their helmets, and we'd spend an hour riding the sidewalks through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the sidewalks were wide, and honestly, it felt safer than taking them anywhere else. For about 3 weeks, everything was perfect. Then one Tuesday evening, while I was sitting on the curb watching the girls race toward the corner, I noticed someone marching across the street toward us. Even before I could see his face clearly, I knew who it was. Derek Holloway, the HOA compliance director. Derek was one of those guys who somehow managed to make every interaction feel like a tax audit. He always carried a clipboard, always wore a tucked-in polo shirt, and always seemed disappointed that other people were enjoying themselves. He walked straight up to my daughters and held up a hand. "Girls, stop right there." They squeezed their brakes and looked confused. Then he turned toward me. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to need you to remove these bicycles from the community walkways." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. "Excuse me." He pulled a laminated sheet from his clipboard like a magician revealing a card trick. Section 14B, recreational cycling is prohibited on HOA-maintained pedestrian pathways. Emma looked up at me and asked, "Dad, what does prohibited mean?" I remember that question hitting me harder than Derek's actual words. Derek answered before I could. "It means no bikes." Lily frowned. "But we're just learning." "I'm sure you are," Derek said, not sounding sure at all. "However, bicycles create liability concerns and increase maintenance costs." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Maintenance costs. They're 80 pounds combined. Derek didn't laugh back. "The board received complaints." "From who?" "Residents." "Which residents?" "That information is confidential." Of course it was. Everything was confidential whenever they didn't have a good answer. The girls slowly rolled their bikes back toward me, their excitement disappearing right in front of my eyes. Melissa had always told me that some people become addicted to tiny amounts of power because it's the only power they've ever had. Standing there looking at Derek, I started wondering if she might be right. "So where exactly do you suggest they ride?" I asked. He shrugged. "There's a public park approximately 2 miles away." 2 miles. For 2 8-year-olds who were still figuring out how to balance. It was such an absurd answer that I almost didn't know how to respond. Derek made a note on his clipboard and added, "Future violations may result in fines." Then he turned around and walked away like he'd just solved a major community crisis. That night, dinner was unusually quiet. Lily barely touched her food. Emma kept asking why they weren't allowed to ride where everyone else walked. Neither Melissa nor I had a good explanation because there wasn't one. Later, after the girls went to bed, I sat alone on the back patio with a cup of coffee and stared across the neighborhood. That's when I noticed the small utility shed sitting near the back fence. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it, but I remembered exactly why it was there. 3 years earlier, when the HOA decided to upgrade every streetlight in the development to a new LED system, they needed a central location for the transformer equipment and lighting controls. The contractor had recommended my property because it sat almost perfectly in the middle of the neighborhood. At the time, the board had approached me and asked for a favor. They promised it would help everyone. They promised maintenance visits would be minimal. They promised the community would be safer. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for a contract. I just said yes because that's what neighbors do. As I sat there that night, I suddenly realized something Derek and the board had apparently forgotten. The entire neighborhood lighting system still ran through that equipment, and the only access point sat inside a structure located entirely on my property. I took another sip of coffee and stared at the shed for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, at least that's what I told myself, but because for the first time since Derek walked across that street, I felt like the story wasn't over yet. The next evening, after dinner, I walked out to the shed with absolutely no idea how far things were about to go. The sun was setting, the girls were inside finishing homework, and the neighborhood looked exactly the way it always did. Neat lawns, identical mailboxes, perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind of place that sells itself as peaceful. What struck me now was how much of that peace depended on things most people never thought about. Electricity, water, infrastructure, the invisible stuff. I unlocked the shed and stepped inside. Mounted on the far wall was the lighting control system, exactly where the contractor had installed it years earlier. There were warning labels everywhere, maintenance records, inspection stickers, and right in the center was the master control breaker for every streetlight in Willow Creek Estates. I stood there longer than I care to admit. Part of me knew this was probably childish. Another part of me remembered two little girls pushing their bikes home because a grown man with a clipboard thought they were a threat to concrete. Eventually, that second part won. I reached over and flipped the switch. Nothing dramatic happened inside the shed. No sparks, no explosions, just a quiet click. But outside, one by one, every streetlight in the neighborhood went dark. I walked back toward the house, trying not to smile. Melissa was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at me for about 3 seconds before saying, "What did you do?" I laughed. "Why does everyone assume I did something?" "Because I've been married to you for 12 years. Fair point. I explained the situation. She stared at me, shook her head, then started laughing so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "You turned off the entire neighborhood?" "Temporarily. Ethan, temporarily." She pointed a finger at me. This is either going to be hilarious or expensive. As it turned out, it became both. By the next morning, the community Facebook page looked like a digital riot. Residents were posting photos of dark streets. People were demanding answers. Someone suggested raccoons had damaged the electrical system. Another person blamed teenagers. One resident somehow connected it to a government conspiracy. Never underestimate how creative bored suburban homeowners can become. The HOA sent an email saying they were investigating the issue. By day 2, the complaints became more serious. Dog walkers hated it. Parents hated it. Evening joggers hated it. One elderly resident sent a 3-page email describing how unsafe she felt checking her mailbox after sunset. Reading that one actually made me feel a little guilty. Then I remembered Derek threatening my daughters with fines. The guilt faded surprisingly fast. On the 3rd day, I received a phone call. "Derek." I answered while helping Emma adjust her bike seat. "Hello." His voice sounded tense. "Mr. Carter, this is Derek Holloway." "Hey Derek, have you noticed the streetlights are out?" I looked around dramatically even though he couldn't see me. "Now that you mention it, yes." Silence. Then, "The power company cannot identify the source of the failure." "That's unfortunate." Another pause. "If you happen to observe anything unusual, the board would appreciate being informed." "Absolutely." We hung up. Emma looked at me. "Was that bike police?" I nearly choked trying not to laugh. "Something like that." By the 5th day, the situation had escalated. A teenager backed into a mailbox while reversing from a driveway. Nobody was hurt, but suddenly the lack of lighting became the neighborhood's biggest issue. The same board that had spent weeks worrying about bicycle tire marks was now facing actual safety complaints. That's when I started noticing something interesting. Residents weren't just angry about the lights anymore. They were angry about the HOA. The outage became a magnifying glass. People started bringing up old frustrations. Excessive fines, selective enforcement, ridiculous landscaping requirements. One homeowner posted, "Maybe if the board spent less time measuring grass height and more time maintaining infrastructure, we'd have lights." That post received over 200 likes. Derek probably lost sleep over that one. Around day 6, the board hired a private electrical contractor named Frank Morales. Frank was the kind of guy who looked like he'd spent 30 years solving problems nobody else could solve. He showed up in a white service truck and spent an entire afternoon tracing wiring throughout the neighborhood. I watched him from my front porch while pretending to read a newspaper. Late that afternoon, I saw him stop near the shed. He studied the equipment, looked at some diagrams, looked back at the shed. Then he nodded slowly. Oh. About 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Frank stood there holding a folder. Afternoon. How's it going? He smiled. Pretty good. I think I found the problem. Really? Yeah. The lighting controls appear to route through equipment located inside your shed. I scratched my chin. Imagine that. Frank looked at me for a second. I got the feeling he knew exactly what was happening. The difference between Frank and Derek was that Frank was smart enough not to say it out loud. Mind if I take a quick look? He asked. Normally I wouldn't care, I said. But electrical equipment can be dangerous. Liability concerns, you know. The corner of his mouth twitched. He knew. I knew he knew. But we were both pretending not to know. Fair point. I'd probably need documentation. Permits. Inspection approval. Inspection approval? Safety first. Frank nodded slowly. Of course. Then he leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. For what it's worth, my daughter rides her bike on our sidewalk every day. I couldn't help smiling. Good man. He drove away. 2 days later, things got really interesting. The HOA held an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Normally, nobody attended those meetings unless free donuts were involved, but this time nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. Melissa convinced me to go. We sat in the back row. Derek looked exhausted. The board president, a retired insurance executive named Harold Benson, tried to reassure residents that progress was being made. Nobody was buying it. Questions started flying. Why weren't the lights fixed? Why had it taken over a week? Why was the HOA spending thousands on consultants? Why were kids being banned from sidewalks while adults were walking through darkness? That last question changed the room. People started connecting the dots. Several parents stood up and shared stories about overly aggressive enforcement. One mother described receiving a warning because her son's basketball hoop was visible from the street. Another family had been fined because holiday decorations stayed up 3 days too long. The frustration had clearly been building for years. The blackout simply gave everyone a reason to talk about it. Derek tried defending the bicycle policy. Huge mistake. One resident actually laughed out loud. Another asked whether the sidewalks were made from gold. The room erupted. For the first time, I saw something I never expected to see. Fear. Not from the residents. From the board. They realized people were no longer upset about streetlights. People were questioning their authority. When the meeting ended, Harold approached me in the parking lot. Ethan, can we talk? Sure. He looked around to make sure nobody was listening. Off the record. Is there any way this situation can be resolved quickly? There it was. The first crack in the wall. I shrugged. Depends on which situation you're talking about. His expression told me he understood exactly what I meant. Neither of us said another word. But as Melissa and I walked back to the truck, she squeezed my arm and smiled. You know they're coming, right? Who? The whole board. She wasn't wrong. Because 3 days later, on a warm Thursday evening while I was teaching Lily and Emma how to lift their front wheels off the ground for tiny wheelies in the driveway, I looked up and saw 4 people walking toward our house together. And judging by the expressions on their faces, they weren't coming to argue anymore. As the 4 board members crossed my driveway, I could tell something had changed. A week earlier, they would have arrived with binders, regulations, and speeches. This time, they looked like people showing up to negotiate after losing a war they never expected to fight. Harold Benson was leading the group. Derek was a few steps behind him, and for the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't carrying a clipboard. Honestly, that might have been the most shocking part of the entire story. Lily and Emma were still riding circles around the driveway, laughing and practicing the little wheelies I'd been teaching them. Harold watched them for a moment before speaking. Those are your girls. I nodded. Yep. He smiled faintly. They're getting pretty good. Derek looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Harold cleared his throat. Ethan, we'd like to discuss a resolution. A resolution to what? I asked, even though we all knew. Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Harold pulled a folder from under his arm. The board met this afternoon. He opened the folder and handed me several pages. We voted to repeal Section 14B effective immediately. I looked down at the paperwork. There it was in black and white. The bicycle restriction was gone. Not suspended. Not under review. Gone. Harold continued. In addition, children's bicycles, scooters, and other recreational activities will now be specifically permitted on community sidewalks, provided reasonable safety guidelines are followed. Melissa stepped out onto the porch behind me just in time to hear that part. I caught her trying not to smile. Then Harold surprised me again. We're also installing children at play signs throughout the neighborhood. For a second, nobody spoke. The girls rode past us, completely unaware that they had just won a fight they didn't even understand. Then Derek finally opened his mouth. The board recognizes that perhaps the previous policy was overly restrictive. I nearly laughed. Overly restrictive. That was one way to describe threatening 8-year-olds over bicycles. But before I could respond, Harold kept going. There's one more thing. He reached into the folder and pulled out another document. The community attorney reviewed the equipment arrangement involving your shed. Now that got my attention. And apparently the association should have executed a formal access agreement years ago. I wasn't surprised. The HOA rarely paid attention to details until those details became expensive. Harold handed me the second document. We're prepared to lease the equipment space from you going forward. $150 per month, with annual increases tied to inflation. Melissa's eyebrows shot up. I looked down at the agreement and then back at the board. You want to pay me rent? Harold nodded. We believe that's appropriate. Behind him, Derek looked like every word physically hurt. For years, the board had acted like they owned everything in the neighborhood. Now they were standing in my driveway offering monthly payments just to keep their lights on. The irony was almost too perfect. I took my time reading through the documents. Not because I needed to, mostly because I wanted them to sweat a little. Finally, I folded the papers and smiled. Seems reasonable. The relief on their faces was immediate. Harold actually exhaled. One of the other board members smiled for the first time all evening. Derek stared at the pavement. We exchanged a few more details, signed the preliminary agreement, and then the group headed back toward the street. About halfway to the sidewalk, Derek stopped and turned around. For a second, I thought he was going to start another argument. Instead, he looked at the girls riding around the driveway. Then he looked at me. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I used to ride my bike everywhere when I was their age. It was probably the most human thing I'd ever heard him say. Before I could answer, he turned and walked away. That night, after the sun had fully disappeared and the neighborhood settled into silence, I grabbed the key to the shed and headed out back. The air was warm. Crickets were chirping. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The lighting control panel sat exactly where it always had. Waiting. I stood there for a moment thinking about everything that had happened. The truth is, it had never really been about the lights. And it wasn't even about the bikes. It was about respect. It was about the difference between building a community and controlling one. Too many people get a little authority and forget that the people around them are human beings. They stop listening. They stop caring. They start treating neighbors like problems that need to be managed. Maybe that was what bothered me most from the beginning. Not the rule itself, but the attitude behind it. I reached over and flipped the breaker. Click. A few seconds later, through the shed window, I watched the neighborhood come back to life. One streetlight, then another, block after block glowing warm against the darkness. It was almost beautiful. The next morning, I sat on the front porch drinking coffee while Lily and Emma rode their bikes down the sidewalk. Nobody stopped them. Nobody complained. A few neighbors actually waved. One elderly woman smiled and told the girls to be careful around the corner. That's it. That's all it took. Common sense. A little kindness. The funny thing is, people still argue about what happened whenever the story comes up. Some say I was justified. Others think I went too far. Maybe they're both right. Maybe turning off an entire neighborhood's streetlights wasn't exactly the mature solution. Then again, threatening children with fines over bicycles wasn't exactly mature either. All I know is this. Sometimes the people making the rules get so comfortable telling everyone else what to do that they forget something important. Every system depends on somebody. Every bit of authority has limits. And every now and then, the person holding the real leverage isn't sitting in the boardroom. They're standing quietly in their driveway watching their kids learn how to ride a bike. So now I want to hear from you. Was I wrong for forcing the HOA's hand? Or did the board get exactly what it deserved? If you were in my position, would you have let the rules stand and kept your kids off the sidewalks? Or would you have found your own way to remind the neighborhood that common sense matters more than power? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought rules were more important than people, share your story too. I'd love to read it.